Hello, welcome to today's class. This is the final week of our 12-week lectures on social theory, concepts and debates, and we are continuing on our series of perspectives on fill in the blank. We've already done one. We did a lecture on perspectives on urbanization in the last week, and this week I want to start by looking at globalization. So with these lectures, I'm not going very deep into one particular theorist, but I'm talking about the different ways in which these very contemporary processes have been and continue to be conceptualized. So globalization is something that all of you have a sense of just by being present in the contemporary world. And as social scientists, it's a process that has challenged many of our existing ways of looking at the world in terms of bounded by the nation state or in terms of some of the stable categories of the social sciences. It largely refers to this process of interconnectedness, and the process of interconnectedness looked at as economic, as political, as cultural. And in order to illustrate that, I've put up here a map of the world which shows flights flying around the world at a particular point. And this is a fairly recent map, and if you notice, you would see some gaps in the map. For example, here you see gaps on the Middle East, around the Middle East. You see Iran, Iraq doesn't seem to have too many flights over there. Ukraine is in a no-fly zone. And so one starts to see how this interconnectedness also is fraught with the geopolitics of what is going around in the world. It could be a political process, a bilaterally political process. It could be something that is geological. So a volcanic eruption in Indonesia might also create a no-fly zone and then therefore challenge the seamless interconnectedness that we often take for granted in today's world. So with that, let's investigate how we understand globalization. Now, globalization has been, as a term, has been under debate. In the 80s, scholars were debating whether globalization is the term that would explain the process of integration that is ongoing, and if there is something fundamentally different in the interconnectedness of the world that we see today. Scholars have argued that there isn't perhaps something very new. It is something that has been going on. This interconnection is incremental, yes, but it is not something very new. Others have shown how it is deeply transformed the way we live our everyday life. So, for example, the experience of instant communication, the process, the fact that we can instantly be in touch with somebody who lives far away from us in a different continent, in the different part of the world, and connect emotionally, see them, speak with them. Just this aspect of instant communication has fundamentally transformed even our most intimate lives. Therefore, many scholars would argue that there is something quite transformational in the way integration is also unfolding in the contemporary world, and technology has a large part to do with it. But let us take a brief moment to look at some of the world processes, and I've listed only a very few, that have contributed to this increasing coming together of the world as one unit of analysis. So, I've put up here selectively 1492 Columbus lands in America. So there is two continents that come in contact with each other. 1600 the East India Company is founded, and 1757 was the Battle of Plassey that enabled the Britishers to establish a strong foothold in the Indian subcontinent and establish what became the British Empire. This period before 1757 can largely be seen as that of early global capitalism, of expansion, of connection, of coming in touch with other parts of the world, other parts of the globe, and establishing colonies there, and increasing integration of economics and politics and also culture. Then we see industrial and colonial capitalism with the Suez Canal opening, the invention of the steam engine, 1884, drawing of Africa's colonial boundaries at the Berlin Conference, and the associated slave trade. Now, the world wars also played a very important role in terms of globalization. So, I've listed both the world wars here, but as soon as the Second World War ends, or pretty much just before it, we see the establishment of the International Monetary Fund, headquartered in Washington, D.C., charged with the rebuilding of countries that were devastated by the war. You see the interference of other countries in other countries, and the fact that this was established and headquartered in Washington, D.C. is no less significant, as it tells of the emergence of what we now know as the US hegemony. World Bank is established in 1945, again headquartered in Washington, D.C. United Nations is also established in 1945, headquartered in New York City. Then we have the General Agreement of Trades and Tariffs, which eventually goes on to become the World Trade Organization. 1948, we have the World Health Organization. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is established in 1949, headquartered in Brussels in Belgium. So this is basically, one can see alliances and coming togethers amongst Western Europe largely and the United States. Now, this is also the period of the Cold War, and both the USSR and the United States are vying for influence over the rest of the world. In that context, there is the Bandung Conference in Indonesia and the emergence of the non-aligned movement to claim what became the Third World. In the 1960s, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, what we know as OPEC, is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. 1971, China joins the United Nations. 1976, there is the OPEC Fund for International Development established. So with this, you see how in the developmental projects of the nation state, countries other than that particular nation state are invested. This is explained by concepts like modernization theory, which shows development as a linear process that needs to progress in a particular direction. It also speaks of histories of Cold War and the vying for influence that I just spoke about. 1989, the Cold War is about to end. There is the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Eventually, the USSR also collapses. Then in 1991, very important for India, is the liberalization of the Indian economy. 1995 is when the World Trade Organization is established. 2001, you see terrorist attacks on the World Trade Organization, the towers in New York City, and this is termed as the global war on terror, right? New York City is one city in one country, and yet the label of global is applied to that particular act of terror. So this also tells a story of a globalizing, increasingly connected world. 2002, China joins WTO. 2008, the economic recession, which began as a subprime crisis in the western part of United States, becomes a global economic recession, speaking once again of the economic integration of trade and other economic activities at a global scale. 2020, also we see the global COVID-19 pandemic and much more. This is a list that can keep going on, but I just wanted to show you that this is a process that began much far back and that it incrementally has transformed our everyday lives, our social lives. Now, several scholars have discussed globalization, and I'm going to speak of a few, and then I will invite Umang Malik to speak about one particular essay that tells the narrative of globalization. But before that, let me speak to you about Anthony Giddens. Anthony Giddens tells us that what we are experiencing right now is a disembeddedness of time and space, such that you can instantly get in touch with somebody much far away. So time seems to have collapsed. Harvey also has used the term time-space compression. Anthony Giddens uses the term time-space distanciation. You can be totally disconnected from somebody living in the apartment next to you, and yet be very well integrated with people living in far off continents. So this is a fundamental shift in the way we relate socially to others. Anthony Giddens further writes, globalization can thus be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. So the local is no longer the local, right? Because the local is also constituted by many global processes. This is also something that Doreen Massey had pointed out to us in her book, The Global Sense of Place. Anthony Giddens tells us that globalization is not a single process, but a complex mixture of processes which often act in contradictory ways. So economic globalization might not be in tune with political globalization and may have contradictions when we look at the way culture is globalizing. Basically, one of the points that Anthony Giddens is trying to make is that economic, political, cultural, all of these forms of globalization are interconnected and yet contradictory, and they operate at multiple scales such that our most intimate lives can be a result of global influences that are situated in a time and space very different from that which we locally inhabit. Let us also look at the work of Immanuel Wallerstein, who does not see globalization as something that is like a sharp shift. In fact, he's been known to call it so-called globalization. And he does so because he does a very meticulous historical analysis of the way modernity or global capitalism began in Western Europe in the 16th century and then spread to the rest of the world, and the kind of shifts that this particular spreading has brought in our social lives. So Wallerstein tells us that globalization is a cyclical process, and as a cyclical process, it has been happening throughout the history of modern world system. He uses the word world system. We've spoken about this before. He divides the world into core, semi-periphery and peripheral areas which are hierarchical in their ability to exploit labor and resources from the other. So the world system, he writes, is a social system, one that has boundaries, structures, member groups, rules of legitimation and coherence. And it cannot be understood without attention to historical dynamics and what he calls a geographical division of labor. Now, this geographical division of labor is an occupational division in which there are hierarchies. And to that, he writes, it is a world system not because it encompasses the whole world, but because it is larger than any juridicially defined political unit. And it is a world economy because the basic linkage between the parts of the world are economic. Wallerstein is a Marxist scholar, and in that sense, he views economy as central to all of this. Therefore, the geographical division of labor also. He speaks about how the base is influencing the superstructure, and contrary to how Weber speaks about the relationship of religion and capitalism, where Protestantism has elective affinity towards capitalism, and therefore you see more Protestant nations doing well in terms of capitalist development. Wallerstein kind of turns that around and says it is the nature of economic growth, it is the nature of states that emerge under capitalist development that then distance the Catholic Church from affairs of administration and governance, and through that process, in fact, Protestantism and Catholicism emerge in either the core states or the periphery states. So the division here between Protestant states and Catholic states, he explains via the economy, quite a appending of what Weber was trying to argue. Then we come to Saskia Sassen. Unlike Wallerstein, who is speaking to us about looking at the world as one system, so he is speaking at a very different scale, Saskia Sassen alerts us to the idea of global cities. So there are cities, New York, London, Tokyo, she names Mexico City, she names Sao Paulo. It is these cities that lay the groundwork for what we now know as globalization. So she's moved emphasis from the scale of the nation state. She's also not really looking at the scale of the world, but she's looking at the urban scale not in terms of the world city, but in terms of a global city, and there's a difference that she articulates. World cities, she says, existed even before, but they were not the nodes that enabled the kind of accelerated connections in terms of financial networks that the global cities do. So she writes, the global economy needs to be produced, reproduced, serviced and financed. Its operational functions have become so specialized that they can no longer be contained in the functions of corporate headquarters. And these corporate headquarters also, we all know, are spread throughout the world in global cities. So global cities are strategic sites for the production of these specialized functions to run and coordinate the global economy. Inevitably located in national territories, global cities are the organization and institutional space for major dynamics of denationalization. So even as these global cities are located inside nation states, they are the drivers of what she terms as denationalization, or the loss of autonomy of the nation state in matters of governance of their own nation state. Although she also says, while it takes away the autonomy of the nation state, it opens up the possibility for a nation state to engage at the global level. So therefore, states become the strategic institutional domains in which critical work on the development of globalization takes place. Now, in a globalizing world, it is not just finances or commodities that are circulating, but so are people and ideas. But the framework, she argues, of immigration does not allow us to look at this movement of people in the complexity that it entails. And for that, she writes, the language of immigration overlooks the transnationalization in the formation of identities and loyalties amongst various population segments that explicitly reject the imagined community of the nation. With this rejection come new solidarities and notions of membership. So you see already, we are looking at different social scientists reading the social complexities of the global from many different perspectives, although each one of them would agree to the increasing economic, political and cultural integration definition of globalization. Lastly, I want to bring up the work of Manuel Castells and his notion of the network society. So he would argue that it is not the city or the nation state or the world system that is the unit of analysis, but it is the network itself, and that we need to look at the network. Castells is somewhat hopeful of the process called globalization, and despite what we are witnessing in terms of increasing inequalities between core and peripheral areas that Immanuel Wallerstein would point us towards, he talks about the fact that globalization in fact could lead to a deepening of democracy. He writes, the old mechanisms of government don't work in a society where citizens live in the same information environment as those in power over them. So the internet in that sense for him opens up the possibility of a much deeper democracy than was possible without the internet. Now, to speak about democracy and its relationship with globalization, I have invited Umang Malik to come speak with us. Umang recently graduated with a BA in Politics, Philosophy and Economics, PPE, from Bennington College in Vermont, United States. And he is interested in American constitutionalism, in questions of social trust, of democracy. His undergraduate thesis was on American international relations under the Biden administration, and I thought that we could learn from his readings on the relationship between democracy and globalization. So with that, I hand over to Umang.
Hi, I want to share an important perspective on globalization. It's not a strictly social theoretic perspective, more aligned with my field of study. It's a more political scientific perspective on globalization. That is the perspective of Benjamin Barber in the book Jihad versus McWorld. Benjamin Barber was a political scientist, a political theorist, and a professor at Rutgers. His critiques of globalization are similar to those of many other social theorists. While he acknowledges the benefits of globalization, its ability to generate wealth and prosperity, to drive technological progress, and so on, he takes issue with the way it dilutes the power of nation states and homogenizes culture. So he writes, common markets demand a common language as well as a common currency, and they produce common behaviors of the kind bred by cosmopolitan city life everywhere. This is what he calls McWorld, a homogenized cosmopolitan culture that is determined by corporations and market forces rather than by any kind of democratic mechanism. But he is not just concerned with globalization, rather he contrasts globalization as a centripetal force with what he considers the centrifugal force of identity politics and tribal nationalism. Nationalism is not necessarily a divisive force. He acknowledges that previous forms of nationalism were constructive in stitching together many different polities, but he writes that nationalism today is, quote, more often a reactionary and divisive force, pulverizing the very nations it once helped cement together. Consider the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Barber first wrote about Jihad versus McWorld in 1992, right as Yugoslavia was breaking down into smaller ethnically and tribally defined nation states. So it is this kind of divisive nationalism that Barber somewhat offensively refers to as jihad. So Barber says that jihad and McWorld constitute the axial principles of our age. The divisive centrifugal influence of tribal identity politics and the centripetal universalizing influence of economic globalization. Barber sees these as totalizing global forces, and he is concerned with these forces because he says both of them pose a threat to democracy. How do they pose a threat to democracy? McWorld, he says, is indifferent to and at times hostile to democracy. Here, Barber engages libertarian economists such as Milton Friedman, who argued that free market economies necessarily produce freer societies. Barber finds that vision is complicated by the example of the new Asian economies. So he writes, on the whole, it has been easier to counter the West's political ideas than McWorld's seductive lifestyles. The authoritarian experiments, communist and non-communist alike in Vietnam, Singapore, Korea, and China, are proof of how easy it is to sever free markets from free political institutions. So, globalization is indifferent to democracy. More importantly, globalization puts cultural power in the hands of global entities rather than national entities. This is a problem, Barber says, because democracy happens at a national level. Cosmopolitans have rights as individuals, but they cannot act as a community. There is no global public, he writes, potent enough to take on McWorld's global privates. As a result, there is little democratic counter to the market logic of McWorld. But how to regulate the impact of global corporations when they operate across the borders of 100 different countries, each with its own environmental laws? On the other hand, we have narrow identity-based separatism. He lists as examples the IRA in Northern Ireland, Puerto Rican nationalism, Quebecois separatism, where McWorld seeks to impose a culture and community larger than any nation state. Identity politics defines a community smaller than the nation state and more important than the nation state. The goal is to create a narrower definition of who belongs in the political community, breaking the nation state down into who belongs and who doesn't belong. The problem is that this can create further fragmentations. Barber gives the example of French linguistic nationalism. On the one hand, the Académie Française seeks to define a pure French, proactively replacing English loanwords. On the other hand, dialect regions within France seek to break that down even further. Basque, Norman, and Breton now act to resist the imposition of Parisian French and protect their pure dialects. He writes, jihad, even in its most specific manifestations, almost always turns out to not simply be a struggle on behalf of an ethnic fragment for self-determination, but a compound struggle within that fragment that risks still greater fragmentation and plenty of confusion as well. Once the parts feel justified in jettisoning the whole, the logic of jihad does not necessarily stop with the first and primary layer of fragments. If Quebec leaves Canada, non-Quebecois francophones may lose their equal place in New Brunswick. And if Quebec leaves Canada, why should not the Cree leave Quebec? Why then should not Anglophone villages leave Quebec or opt out of a self-determining Cree nation that they find themselves inhabiting? And if a few francophones reside in the predominantly English villages, in the predominantly Cree region of predominantly French Quebec, what about their status? So we can see that jihad or nationalism is kind of recursively fragmentary. So what's at stake here then? What do jihad and McWorld have in common? They both undermine the traditional liberal notion of citizenship. The traditional liberal nation state is both bounded and diverse. Barber writes, quote, "The lesson of modern pluralism that undergirds the concerns of this book is that humankind depends for its liberty on variety and difference. We are governed best when we live in several spheres, each with its own rules and each with its own benefits, none wholly dominated by another. Only a democratic polity has an interest in and the power to preserve the autonomy of the several realms. When other domains wrest sovereignty away from the state, whether they are religious or economic, the result is a kind of totalitarian coordination. So a successful democracy has to balance plural domains. Religious, identitarian, economic, civil, each domain has its benefits. Identity politics allows us to understand ourselves and find community. Economic globalization enables prosperity and reduces poverty. But no one domain can be allowed to dominate the others. Now, Barber is uncertain about solutions. He acknowledges that strong examples of these solutions don't quite yet exist, and they will have to be built. But he first invokes civil society as a primary mediator. He invokes John Dewey, who called democracy a way of life. It is one thing to adopt a democratic legal framework, but much more difficult to build the civil infrastructure for it. Schools, foundations, high-quality journalistic organizations, communities that are not defined by markets or by identitarianism. He writes, how civil society can be forged in an international environment is an extraordinary challenge. Recognizing that it needs to be forged is, however, the first step towards salvaging a place for strong democracy in the world of McWorld. The next step, he writes, once democracies have rebuilt civil society, is that they must be aligned by some form of global organization that permits cooperation without destroying their autonomy. His solution is confederalism, which is a looser, more voluntary association of sovereigns. His model is the American Articles of Confederation. Before the United States was a proper federation, it was a much looser association of independent states. Carolina, New York, Pennsylvania, and so on were independent countries who all signed a treaty of confederation. Such a confederation, he says, has a potential to act as a global counterweight to McWorld. While he is critical of the European Union, he sees potential in the way that national regions have sought greater representation within Europe, rather than splintering into nationalistic factions and breaking down their countries. He writes, strong democracy needs citizens. Citizens need civil society. Civil society requires a form of association not bound by identity politics. That form of association is democracy. Or, global democracy needs confederalism, a non-compulsory form of association rooted in friendship and mutual interests. Confederalism depends on member states that are well rooted in civil society, and on citizens for whom the other is not synonymous with the enemy. I'll conclude with a short snippet from a speech by President Clinton to illustrate how influential Barber's ideas were in the 1990s when so many of these issues were coming to a head. So I'll let Clinton take it from here.
I've been reading this. This is a fascinating book by a man named Benjamin Barber, whom I had the privilege to know, called Jihad versus McWorld. Now, let me tell you what the essential argument here is. Let me tell you why I believe it's important. Mr. Barber is arguing that democracy and the ability to hold people together and have reliable, predictable, good lives for people who work hard and do the right thing is being threatened today, first of all, by the globalization of the economy, which has a lot of benefits for those of us who have good educations and can benefit from it, with the movement of money and technology all across the world. But it's elevating consumerism to even higher and higher levels and promoting short-term gains. You watch this money, we watch it every day. Billions and trillions of dollars moving across the globe in the split of an eye just because of an event here, an event there, an event the other place. It's very hard in those conditions to preserve, even in the wealthy, powerful countries, the conditions of stable, ordinary life. Therefore, you see what happens in America. We have 7 million new jobs. We have all these things that are happening that are good. But most hourly wage earners are working harder for the same or less money than they were making 10 years ago. And a lot of people feel insecure in their jobs because the economy is changing so much, and they have no confidence that if they lose the job they have, they can get another one that's just as good or better. And that's a big problem for America. If people think they're willing to show up every day, they're working hard, they're doing right by their kids, they wouldn't break the law, they wouldn't cheat the government out of a nickel on their taxes, they wouldn't begin to do anything wrong, and they still may not make it. That's a problem for America. The other word, jihad, as you know, refers to holy war, the Arabic concept, the Muslim concept of the holy war. It's not an anti-Muslim book, by the way. Islam is a beautiful religion with great values. What it refers to is, as people face a world that they cannot control, when they think that democracy is not going to work for them, that they can't keep the family of the United States or the family of France or Germany or Russia or Estonia or you name it together. They are vulnerable because their nerves are raw and they have no sense of certainty to extreme manifestations of people who claim to have revealed truth. So that the likelihood of having more conflicts rooted in ethnic, racial, or religious differences increases perversely as the world becomes more economically integrated. About once in 100 years, this sort of thing happens. We are going through a level of change in the way we work and live that is comparable to the change we went through when we moved from being an agrarian society to an industrial, more urbanized society. And it took our country from roughly the end of the 1890s until about 1916 to sort through all that. I mean, it's a continuing process, but we basically had to decide, what is the responsibility that we have as a country? What does the government have to do? How will we deal with this? Now we're moving out of that age to a more information-based, technology-based age. We're moving from the Cold War to the global economy. We're moving from the possibility of nuclear war between superpowers to the possibility that terrorists can carry around biological weapons that kill people in Japanese subways or make homemade bombs that blow up the World Trade Center or the federal building in Oklahoma. Believe me, it's better that we don't have to worry as much about everybody being wiped out. Let's not kid ourselves. But it's important to realize that our great country, this family of America, has forces beyond it economically that are pulling at our ability to hold everybody together. And in reaction to the insecurity that is caused and the uncertainty that is caused, there are forces internally in every great democracy forcing people to be divided among themselves.